All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA speaker session entitled Avoiding a Climate Arms Race, Why We Need the Baruch Plan 2.0 for Climate Geoengineering. This presentation is part of SMA's Anticipating the Future Operational Environment, or APO, effort series. And I'd like to thank Dr. Elizabeth Chalecki for taking the time to present and participate today.
Happy to be here.
All right, so before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll also have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the presentation or during the Q&A, go ahead and submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's the chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name is going to be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager, and questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed. So please make sure to send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. Make sure to keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event. If you're in the audience, those who don't do so will be removed from the event. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to her. Dr. Elizabeth Chalecki is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Nebraska-Omaha and a research chair with Fulbright Canada. Her expertise lies in the areas of climate change and security, international environment policy, and the intersection of science and technology and IR. Dr. Chalecki has authored groundbreaking research on geoengineering and just war, and has published over 25 books, articles, and book chapters on diverse topics such as climate change and Arctic security, environmental terrorism, climate change and international law, etc. She also serves as an environmental security subject matter expert for NATO. So Dr. Chalecki, I will turn the floor over to you now, and I will also stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It is good to be here today, and I'm pleased to see that there is such interest in this topic. Let me turn on the screen here. I think you guys can see it now. I want to talk to you guys. I want to talk to you guys today about something that I would not have thought we'd ever need to discuss, which is the potential for a climate arms race. You don't forbid technology that you don't have, but now we have to reconsider, what does it mean if we have purposeful climate manipulation technology, known broadly as geoengineering? So today's talk is going to be structured like this. We're going to talk about the climate change problem. I've subtitled this, How Do We Get Ourselves into This Mess? Because this isn't a natural disaster in the strictest sense. We did this to ourselves. So we're going to find out how we got into the climate change fix we're in. Then we're going to compare that with the international relations reality. Sovereign states don't recognize the climate as a threat, but they need to, because it's going to affect everyone to one degree or another. We're going to look historically at the 1946 Baruch Plan, which is the UN's first attempt to put nuclear weapons under international control, and what went wrong in the attempted implementation of this plan. And finally, we're going to look at how we can reboot it for a climate arms race. This graph here on the right is from NASA. This is temperature anomalies from 1880 to 2016. I can't find a more updated version of this one, or I would have used it. But you can see that the climate is getting warmer and warmer. And if this had extended on to 2022, you would see that red line go even higher. It's actually kind of mesmerizing to look at this, because you can see the different periods in our economic development. You can see the war years, you can see the globalization of the 80s and 90s. And now, after 2000, when China's production really came online, we see more carbon emissions than ever before. So how do we get ourselves into this mess? Well, this graph you see on the right here, this Earth you see on the right, is observed change in surface temperature from the end of the last century to about 110 years in the future. This isn't the output, this is an output from a computer model. This is actually observed surface temperature. And you can see where we have white spots, it's not enough data to make a solid inference or solid measurement, but you can see that the Earth is getting warmer overall. The only vaguely cool spot you see is off the coast of Greenland. And if you look north of it, you can see 3 red X's on the surface of Greenland. The reason the North Atlantic is becoming cooler is because of Earth-based, land-based ice melt running off of Greenland into the North Atlantic. These measurements, as I mentioned, are observed via satellite and other technologies. They are not the output of a model. And since the 1950s, these are unprecedented in speed and scale. Some people say, well, the Earth changes all the time. That's true. It's changing faster and more severely than anything we've ever been able to account for before using only natural processes. these effects of climate change, including that box there you can see on the left, temperatures, heat waves, floods, droughts, loss of coastline. You can read all those dire effects of climate change. This is what we've seen so far. We're going to see quite a bit more in the future. Now we have a choice to make, ladies and gentlemen. The IPCC in their last report put out a couple of model runs, basing it off of what we know about average surface temperature. What is the Earth going to look like from the end of last century to the end of this century, depending on the energy choices that we make now? The Earth you can see here on the screen, RCP 2.6 is their attempt to geek out a little bit, but it basically means renewable energy Earth. If we leave the coal and the oil and the gas in the ground, leave the hydrocarbons there and go hard for renewable energy now, this is the estimated warming that we're going to be seeing by the end of this century. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we might not live to see this, but our children might. In fact, the younger of you in the audience, your children definitely will see this. You can see that there's significant warming over land and significant warming in the Arctic, a strategically significant region. Well, this is what the Earth is going to look like if we pick renewable energy now. We might still have nations. We might still have concepts like democracy and capitalism and individualism. We might be able to live with this Earth. If we don't, if we go for fossil fuels, business as usual Earth, this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to give you a few seconds to absorb that, ladies and gentlemen, not only the difference between the two, but if you look at the scale at the bottom of the page, this is unbelievable. When I showed this to my students in the Graduate International Relations Seminar at UNO, they gasped and they said, is this world even habitable? I said, I don't know. That's a good question because the Earth has never been this hot while humans have been on it. Ladies and gentlemen, if we don't change our energy course, we are literally remaking the face of our planet to a prehistoric point. Now, can humanity adapt to this? Maybe. But that doesn't mean we're going to have a country like, oh, the United States still in existence. So we have to consider the choice that we make now gives us one of these two Earths, slightly warm Earth or scary red Earth. It's easy to look to the future and say, well, this is what our model runs are telling us, but how do we get there from here? Climate change is not a problem that most states know how to deal with. It's easy to put it off into the future. Let some future generation deal with the costs of it while we take the benefits for ourselves now. But this climate change reality that we're going to be facing shifts every condition and assumption that states rely on for their assumptions about sovereignty and security. We assume that the climate is a stable backdrop, and then we conduct all sorts of operations against that backdrop. But it's not stable. And the fourth order climate security concerns coming from increasing temperature, increasing precipitation or changing precipitation, increasing sea level rise, and increasing extreme weather events up through agricultural shortages, food insecurity, riots, and so on, infectious diseases, we end up with a list of climate security concerns. Developing nations have a real sense of injustice about climate change because they're the ones that are bearing the greater part of the cost, but they weren't the ones that benefited from doing it in the first place. Nations like the United States and others can lose the cooperation of allies and suffer reciprocity from our decisions surrounding energy and climate. The way we act on the international stage gets us allies or enemies. And finally, climate change can facilitate extremism. And what I mean by this is when governments don't react to climate change, when they don't take the actions necessary to avoid scary red Earth, you're going to see a larger number of citizens taking actions into their own hands in both the developing world and the developing world. Now, in order to avoid scary red Earth, we have some options. Well, we can certainly try to mitigate climate change. This means slow down our emission of greenhouse gases. We can try to adapt to it. This means putting up seawalls or levees or other types of adaptive mechanisms. Both of these are either expensive, painful, or only work in a limited capacity. We have a third option, a technological fix, and I'm using the term fix kind of sarcastically at the moment. Geoengineering is an increasingly probable option in an anarchic world, and there are no rules to govern its use. I said in the beginning, you don't forbid technology you don't have. Well, now we do have it. So what is geoengineering? This is a very broad term, meaning climate manipulation technologies. And there's a few definitions there on the left side of the screen. I'm not going to read all those for you, but you can see that the graphic in the middle shows you some idea of how these might work. Now, there's two main technologies, there's two main technological paths at work here. Number one is called solar radiation management, or solar geo. This means we can bounce sunlight out of the atmosphere before it has a chance to reach the ground. The second type is called CDR, or carbon dioxide removal. And this is literally sucking carbon and other greenhouse gases out of the air and sequestering them either
Dr. Chalecki, are you there?
that's wicked expensive. So I don't think we'd be able to do that. But some of these are doable right now. And this is where we need to think about what kinds of technological options we have available to us and what theirs might be. Most of these land-based methods of geoengineering would be governed by the laws of the country in which they reside. So if I'm planting trees to sequester carbon, then that's governed by the forestry laws of that particular country. But there are several of them that are governed, that are deployable, from the global commons, the atmosphere or the high seas. That means sulfur aerosol injection, marine-based cloud brightening, and iron ocean fertilization. This basically is the high seas or the upper atmosphere. Beyond 24 nautical miles per the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that's all high seas. International law, with some exceptions, doesn't really apply out there. And we don't have any clear determination as to where the atmosphere ends. So anything in the upper atmosphere, like SAI, that could be completely ungoverned. Now, if you've read anything about geoengineering or heard anything about it in the news or in popular media, you've seen some pretty spectacular headlines about this. Planet hacking, Snowpiercer-esque, mad scientist ScopeX extinction scheme, and my favorite, Bill Gates blots out the sun. Okay, Bill Gates is not blotting out the sun. What Bill Gates is doing is providing some money for some sulfur aerosol injection experiments. So this is a tiny fraction of sunlight would be bouncing away from the atmosphere. But again, experiments aren't going to engender much public confidence unless we can govern them in some way. Recent and current experiments ongoing include the following. In 2009, Germany and India conducted a joint venture experiment called LOHAFEX, which was to dump iron into a particular patch of the southern Atlantic Ocean near Antarctica in order to stimulate the growth of plankton and sequester carbon. The results of this were inconclusive. So we don't really have very much more about ocean iron fertilization other than a couple of inconclusive experiments. The other one that I wanted to mention is called ScopeX, and this was set to be carried out over Sweden, but it was canceled because of objections from the native community there. This was run out of Harvard University, including several private donors and Bill Gates. And the idea, again, was that it was going to put sulfur particles up into the upper atmosphere in order to bounce sunlight away. Well, the native people weren't consulted and they didn't like it, so the government canceled it. Marine-based cloud brightening was conducted by Southern Cross University over the Great Barrier Reef, and it worked pretty well. The problem with some of these experiments is that once you start them, you have to keep doing them. And finally, Sky River is a Chinese government attempt at cloud seeding over the Tibetan Plateau. They have claimed a 10% increase in precipitation, but I have also got some independent verification that this isn't working as well as they think it is. So experiments here are ongoing, but we don't really have a whole geoengineering global regime yet. This is why we need to put one in place ahead of time. What kind of constraints do we have on these types of technologies? Well, if we look to international environmental law, it's all piecemeal. The London Dumping Convention of 1972 says that if iron seeding is classified as pollution, then it's illegal to dump it in the ocean, if it's classified as pollution. The Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention of 1979 said you can't necessarily spew sulfur into the atmosphere if it contributes to acid rain. The Convention on the Law of the Sea requires all scientific experiments to be carried out for the benefit of humankind. Well, how do you determine whether or not the experiment is for the benefit of humankind unless you do it? And finally, the 1992 CBD says that you must do more research on geoengineering before you deploy it. Well, the problem is if you're deploying a big experiment, what's the difference between an experimental test and an actual deployment of the technology? By the time you get a planetary scale experiment going, there's no difference between experiment and the real thing. Well, let's look to the laws of war then. What kinds of information do we have on restraining commons-based geoengineering in that arena of law? The 1997 Environmental Modification Convention prohibits hostile use of environmental modification technologies. What does hostile mean? This has never been adjudicated anywhere in any court of law or in any opinion. So any nation wanting to attempt one of these technological tests or experiments might say, well, we have no hostile intent. In fact, we're trying to help people. Geneva Protocol 1 of the same year prohibits widespread, long-lasting, and severe damage to the environment. Again, the problem is that these terms have not been defined or adjudicated in any way. What does widespread mean? Is that over a continent? Is that over a city? Is that over someone's backyard? Long-lasting and severe. What do those terms mean? We don't know. What we do know is that nothing in any law, convention, treaty, or custom prohibits a nation or a state from defending itself from a security threat. So the more we talk about climate change as the security threat that it is, the more we start to weaponize in our minds technologies that might help us fight it. How do we govern technology if we haven't deployed it yet? Well, we can look back to the first time we tried to govern a planet-changing technology. 1946, the Baruch Plan. There's Bernard Baruch in the circle there. This is a photo of the UN Atomic Energy Commission debating the future of atomic weapons. And it looks from the photo like he's having a snooze there in the middle of the discussion. But this plan was put forward by the United States to the brand new United Nations to put all atomic technology under international control. They reasoned that these weapons couldn't be used like regular weapons for three reasons. Number one, they were powerful technology, much too powerful to be considered regular weaponry. Civilians couldn't get out of the way, and the destruction was immense. Number two, there were no countermeasures and no defense to this. We didn't know how to defend against a nuclear weapon, and we still don't. So how do you prohibit these? And finally, there was no secrecy to this. Technology was being spread from nation to nation, and we needed to know how we were going to govern these. Since we can't use them as regular weapons, what do we do with them? Now, the Americans and the Soviets, as you can imagine, disagreed about the terms of the Baruch Plan. The Americans said, we have the nuclear monopoly. When every other nation gives up its technological attempts to create nuclear weapons, we will give up our weapons. Now, this is not what Robert Oppenheimer and the other scientists who advised Bernard Baruch there, that's not what they wanted, but this is what the military wanted. The Soviet position was exactly the opposite. We can't agree to any restrictions until the United States gives up its monopoly. Otherwise, the Soviets are in a one-down position forever. Unanimous consent was required on the part of the UNAEC, and the Soviet Union and Poland abstained from adopting the Baruch Plan. It failed, and the UNAEC itself was disbanded in 1952. The result was the nuclear arms race, at the height of which we had over 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. It's only through technological skill, luck, and dogged diplomacy that we haven't exploded the world ourselves already. So we need to consider, why did the Baruch Plan fail? It didn't fail because of science. It failed because of sovereignty. It failed because no nation was willing to give up their advantage or put themselves at a disadvantage under international control. They didn't see, they saw the risk as greater than the benefit. We need to reconsider this equation, because the same three characteristics that apply to atomic weapons also apply to geoengineering. It's powerful technology. It is literally designed to alter the Earth's climate. In fact, if it's not altering the Earth's climate, it's not doing its job. Geoengineers are replicating elemental geoscale forces, rainstorms, windstorms, weather patterns, sunlight. We've never been able to control this before, not with any degree of accuracy or scale, but we might be able to now. Number two, there's no countermeasures to this and no defense. These technologies are dispersive in nature. You can't control the weather over one particular part of the Earth. These things go around the Earth just like carbon dioxide does. The only way to stop their deployment is with armed force. So if I have a fleet of bombers waiting to spew sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, another nation might decide to bomb them on the runway. Once they're in the air, once their load is dispersed, there's no stopping it. And finally, there's no secrecy here. The logistics needed for deployment of some of these technologies would be either quite large or take a long time, easily noticeable with today's surveillance technology. And finally, scientists already from all over the world are collaborating on this. Scientific papers have got authors in many countries. So the idea of how these technologies could be applied is not held to the government of one particular country or one particular alliance of countries. Everybody's going to know how to do this. So why is this a problem? Why do we need to consider preemptive discussions? Because we're already studying and planning for how to do this. Remember, mitigation is expensive and adaptation is painful. So nations are going to see geoengineering as the technological fix. You can see right there that we have the National Academy of Sciences, has already put out a report called Reflecting Sunlight, and they're thinking about how they would go ahead with these experiments if they needed to do it. Well, it's not crazy. States have attempted to weaponize the weather before, particularly the United States. We have a small history with this. In fact, just recently, ex-President Trump asked if we couldn't just detonate nuclear weapons in hurricanes to break them up. Well, a congresswoman actually had to introduce a bill on the floor of the House prohibiting the president from nuking hurricanes. Hopefully, we won't be nuking any hurricanes, but the idea that we can control weather is durable and it doesn't go away. States can claim no hostile intent. Remember, ENMOD requires hostile intent to trigger its terms. Not every nation's a party to ENMOD, but even if you were, you could say, well, we don't have hostile intent, but it doesn't matter because they could still affect material livability in another state. So if my experiment goes wrong, then I might shift rainfall away from a monsoon area, for example, and tank their agriculture. Oops, sorry about that. Arms races come about due to a perceived imbalance of power between and among states. This is something that if we insist on this principle of sovereignty, we're not going to get around this anytime soon. So we need to know, how can we govern this technology based on the paradigm of sovereignty, which we still have? We reboot the Baruch plan. This is how we avoid a climate arms race. Now, there's 3 parts of the Baruch plan that were particularly applicable just to commons-based geoengineering. Number 1, control of the field. This gives some kind of international geoengineering authority sole power to inspect and license all technology, conduct or oversee deployments, and lead the R&D field. This doesn't mean they have to do it themselves. They can cooperate with states, private firms, universities, corporations, anybody that wants to work with them, but they have a finger in all the pies, if you will. They have an eye on all the experiments and can stop them if they need to. This agency would serve as a clearinghouse for sanctioned experiments and orderly deployments. So you don't have rogue actors attempting to put up competing experiments over different places on the earth. Point number 2, scientific research. They would have the sole power, this authority, to license research in the field. Again, no rogue actors here. This is what we can't afford when it comes to a climate arms race, any more than we could when it came to a nuclear arms race. Experimental designs, patents, materials, all this can still be privately owned and developed. Doesn't mean the government is going to own all this. It just means that they're going to be the ones that serve as the clearinghouse for all of this. And something critical to building public trust is that all research results and ongoing data are publicly available. So this is not something secret that governments hold on to in an attempt to gain an advantage over rival nations. Since this affects the material livability of the entire planet, everybody gets to see the data, and everybody gets to contact this agency if they have any suggestions or concerns. And finally, third point, dangerous and non-dangerous activities. Now, the Baruch plan, the original Baruch plan 1.0, made it very clear that atomic technology was dual use. It had both good and bad applications, and they were attempting to restrict the bad applications, aka weapons, while allowing the good applications, aka energy. So we recognize that this is also applicable to commons-based geoengineering technologies. Some activities can be dangerous and not dangerous. Who is it that makes that determination? It's going to be this international authority, the ability to determine which experiments are working and which are not. And if they're not working, then they get shut down. It is critically important that the good of these experiments outweighs the harm of these experiments. Having an impartial authority to make that decision is going to be key towards ensuring that all of these technologies, once deployed, are benefiting humankind generally, and not just one nation in particular. So we have all sorts of future questions about these kinds of technologies. How accurate are they? How good could they really get? This will only come about with increased experimentation. And what is the national will to be using them? How are we going to say, well, we're going to give up on mitigation. We're going to do our best with adaptation, but it's not going to work the way we need it to work, and we're going to go right for geoengineering. Could these be weaponized in the future? Right now, probably not. But we can't say for certain that future scientific technological development is going to render these any less vague than they are now. Who negotiates agreements like this? Is this multilateral? Is this the whole world? Is this between two powers? Is this what they call minilateral, the states that can do it? All these questions have yet to be determined. We have to define collateral damage from environmental forces. We have to define widespread, long-lasting, and severe. We have to determine who profits from this and who pays the costs of this. There has to be some international mechanism of fairness, or that sense of injustice that's inherent in the climate change problem is just carried forward and given now a new technological edge. And who speaks for those that don't speak for themselves? This will be critical to social acceptance of these kinds of experiments. All these questions can be negotiated and answered. But the one that interests me as a professor of international relations is the one at the bottom. How do we alter the functional meaning of sovereignty in order to take into account the ecological reality of the planet? Remember, sovereignty doesn't require any knowledge whatsoever of ecology. And yet the environmental system is the one on which all other systems, including sovereignty, politics, and security, are built. How do we reconcile this willful ignorance of governments of their ecological basis? This is something, ladies and gentlemen, that I am very interested in examining in the next few years. Climate change, geoengineering technologies, and all sorts of international environmental challenges expose the limitations of traditional political realism as the theory that underpins modern international relations. We assume that all states have equal standing under the law. We assume they all control what's going on within their borders, that what happens in one state does not affect what happens in another state. We know now this is nonsense. The blind spot of realism, among others, is that humanity's relationship with the natural world is a steady state. The climate in the future will be the same as the climate in the past. And all of our security calculations, all the decisions we make about what arms to have and which nations to ally with and which nations to be rivals with, that this takes place against the static backdrop of this stable climate. So we know when the rains are going to come. We know how much wheat we can plant. We know how the city is going to be. All of this is going to be changing because the future is not going to look like the past. So I want to propose this new idea called ecological realism. And this is the realization that every nation's core strategic national interest and their primary strategic objective is the preservation and regeneration of the natural environment. This doesn't mean that nations don't have other security and economic and political concerns. They will. But this now, rather than the continuation of the nation, the preservation of the natural environment becomes the key factor in national strategic planning. This sort of theory shift isn't going to happen overnight, but we have to make this happen, or scary red earth is going to be our inheritance. So here's some academic references. I'm happy to share these with anybody who's interested. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for having me talk to you today.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chalecki. Let me go ahead and adjust the screen view very quickly. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of today's Zoom Gov session. So feel free to keep submitting your questions through our Q&A chat. All right, we've got a lot to get through. So let's start with a question from William Spenley. And this question is, given the RCP scenarios are projections and not predictions, how is uncertainty communicated? Asked another way, what is the quantitative probability of the given temperature increases associated with each RCP?
Okay, yes, the RCPs are projections based on model data that's run forward from models that have been calibrated using past data. If you look, and the graphics I showed you were the result of a compilation of several model runs. So if you go back to the methodology in the IPCC's report as to how they derive these figures, there is different levels of probability attached to each model run. So what you're looking at there is the aggregate of a number of model runs, and I think I mean, the one they've put up there, the one that I showed you, it's over 99%. That's their estimate of the probability of that being within the acceptable range of outcome. I'm sure they have ones that are less red and scary. There's ones that are less probability, lower probabilities. But the one I showed you was a compilation, so there's not a particular figure that I can give you as to the probability that's going to happen. Their general conclusion is greater than 99%, that humans are changing the climate, and that this is what we're going to be seeing if we stay with that RCP by the end of the century. RCP, by the way, stands for Representative Concentration Pathway, and it basically means all the changes that we could make for radiative forcing. It's another scientific term that we can get into later, but it basically means higher levels of warming. So what you're seeing with Scary Red Earth is going to be their 99% estimate that that's what's going to happen if we don't change our energy decisions now.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chalecki. Larry has asked if geoengineering has been incorporated into current computational climate models in order to explore the potential downstream effects.
I believe they are starting to do this, but again, we have to make a lot of assumptions with this, because we don't have very much in the way of experimental data to prove some of these technologies. So we can run the computer model for the climate, we can run the computer model for the geoengineering experiment. Every time you do this, the error bar gets larger and larger for the projection. This is why I'm very interested to see some of these experiments continue. I just want to see the governance put in place to manage them when they do scale up. But I think that some of the climate models are now starting to take into account different types of geoengineering if they're performed this way for this amount of time at this level of intensity and so on. But again, that gives you a range of future projections. But I think they are looking at it now, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Michelle asks, in a more anarchic world, what is the potential for non-state actors to hack geoengineering technology in order to weaponize it in their favor against the state?
They might very well be able to do that. And it would really depend on the kind of technology, right? When I say geoengineering, as I mentioned before, that's a hugely broad term. So, if you're out there planting trees, what's to hack, right? Unless you're literally hacking the tree. But if you're talking about some kind of Flettner ship, that thing that spews seawater into the air to increase the density of clouds and bounce sunlight away from the atmosphere, making the Earth more like Venus, if those are controlled by a computer program, that could be hacked. The computer program itself could be hacked, and these things could be shut off. If you're talking about, the delivery method for sulfur dioxide can vary from balloons to planes to giant projectiles. That can be hacked as well if it's run by a computer. The facility itself might be open to infiltration. There's lots of ways, depending on the deployment technologies, lots of ways for non-state actors to get into it, or other states for that matter. The hacking actor, it doesn't have to be a non-state actor. It could be another state if necessary, in a sort of counter geoengineering type of operation. That's very plausible, yes.
Right, thank you. So along similar lines, Gordon Middleton asked if enforcing no rogue actors, quote unquote, requires a military force to police such constraints.
It would require some sort of force. Whether or not that's a separate military force, I don't know. Whether or not it would be on loan from a UN member state, that's all open for negotiation. If you make it clear that all experiments would go through this agency, then you might find fewer rogue actors if the experiments are generally approved. If they're generally shut down, you see a greater likelihood for rogue actors. Then yes, then it's not ideal, but you basically turn this new agency into a sort of a global police force. I'm hoping we can avoid that, but it might require some sort of force if you have a recalcitrant state actor that just doesn't want to stop its experiments. Yes, you might have to use force.
All right, thank you. Let's go with this question from Nicholas Mancini next. And the question is, unlike nuclear weapons use, it seems plausible that deploying SRM could benefit humanity by avoiding climate impacts. How would the International Control Hub determine when and to what extent to deploy geoengineering? Moreover, what if nations disagree on where to set the thermostat?
That's a great question. And that gets to the need for why we need a global agency like this. How would they determine this? I don't know. I mean, we haven't even set up this agency. We haven't even agreed on the need for this agency yet. I'm trying to advocate we do need it. But how exactly their deliberations would go, I don't know at this point. I'm assuming that they would have to consider, with as much data as they can get a hold of, the ecological and economic pros and cons of any given experiment. So if they're looking at this and saying, well, it looks like we can avoid the worst effects of climate change over this particular area, but then this particular area might suffer, maybe they get remuneration of some kind, or maybe they have a chance to weigh in against the experiment if they think it's going to hurt them. Exactly the workings internally of that agency, that's all to be negotiated.
Thank you. Christy R asked if there are types of briefing, if the type of briefing that they've presented today is being given to large corporations, because individuals don't have enough impact to move the needle alone. Corporate entities must change business practices and how/what they produce and how those changes will trickle down. Are companies making these changes now as well?
I assume you're talking about climate change and not about geoengineering. As far as I know, there aren't any corporations engaging in geoengineering at the present time, although that might change in the future. So a briefing like this one, has it been given to corporations? I don't know if a briefing exactly like this one has been given to corporations. As a side note, I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to hear it. But corporations know about climate change. They can see scary red Earth as well as anybody else. And all of the data the IPCC has is publicly available. It's free to download from their website in any one of the 6 UN official languages, plus others. So if they're smart strategic planners, they should be able to look at this trajectory that we're on towards scary red Earth and say, here's how this is going to affect our business. Here's how we need to adapt or mitigate if we can. And true, I mean, you say corporations, but it really depends on what corporation you're talking about. Are you talking about energy producers? Are you talking about transportation corporations? Are you talking about manufacturing? Are you talking about information technology? All those would adapt or mitigate in different ways. The most resistant ones so far have been large super majors, large energy companies. And that's where we start to, go to them directly and say, look, you want to make a profit now, but you're going to see scary red Earth in the future if you keep doing it the way you're doing it. Are they making changes? I like to think that they're at least thinking about it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chalecki. Let's go with this question from Larry next. And the question is, the Russians in particular have asserted that the US possesses climate changing weapons. Are they referring to the geoengineering methods that you've reviewed? And given the limited results, are the Russians being a bit paranoid about the possibility?
I'm not aware of any Russian accusations against the United States. I think all the governments, Russians included, Russians, Americans, Chinese, Indians, South Koreans, Germans, and so on, all governments are looking into this. But there haven't been any climate changing weapons yet. We have, again, that short list of experiments that I showed you, ScopeX and LOHEFX and so on. Those aren't really weaponized. Those are just sort of proof of concept experiments at this point in time. So I don't know of any climate changing weapons that are functioning right now. Not, Donald Trump and his nuking hurricanes notwithstanding. But the idea is that this has the potential to be weaponized. And so in order to avoid that fate, because remember, we don't have planet B to go to if we mess up planet A, we need to set up some kind of governance before the fact, some kind of anticipatory governance to make sure that these climate manipulation technologies don't get weaponized for the benefit of one state over another. As far as I know right now, that has not yet happened.
All right, thank you. Alexandria Terry has asked, it looks like the average temperature may increase in populated areas may be about 5 degrees at the extreme in your most extreme figure. That's not enough to merit this level of environmental intervention without unknowable outcome. How do you account for the fact that the Earth has been in a warming phase since its local minima in the 19th century? And the spending associated with these tracks must be outrageous. How many seawalls could you build with that kind of allotment?
Okay, so you're talking about spending. You're also talking about a 5-degree maximum. The IPCC's estimate at this point is that several areas will go well above 5 degrees C, maybe as high as 12 degrees C. So I don't want to assign any particular number to the future, because that could change, and it certainly will change based on region. The IPCC, in consultation with lots of different scientists and people working on climate change, have determined that if we go beyond 2 degrees C, above pre-industrial temperatures as a global average, that's when we're letting ourselves in for the really catastrophic effects. So I've never seen any limit of 5C. That could happen. We want to keep it below 2C, but the IPCC estimates in some places as high as 12C, and that would be truly frightening from a climate perspective, because that's hotter than we've ever been while humans are on the Earth. As far as spending goes, this is true. Some of these technologies are very expensive, some goofy expensive. We have to trade off any expense in developing or deploying these kinds of technologies against the expense of what would happen if we don't do it. We tend to think of, oh, well, the Earth is always changing, and it is always changing, but it's changing faster and more severely now, just in the last century, than it ever has. So what's going to happen? Are we going to see more pandemics because of disease vector expansions? Are we going to see more extreme weather events and coastal infrastructure knocked out? Are we going to see more heat waves and droughts? I'm living in Nebraska right now. We're an agricultural state. So we could see failing harvests. What happens if we have food insecurity and food riots? All of that all costs money as well. So we need to make sure that when we say, what does it cost? We are looking at what we're saving by doing it versus what we're paying by doing it. And the cost is the same on either side. Are we paying more in adapting than we would be in geoengineering? And this is something that ecological economists need to sit down and hash this out. They do it every now and then, but they would also be part of this agency. You need economists as well as scientists to say, look, if you do this, the estimated cost is X, but it's going to be X to the second power if you don't do it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chalecki. Jonathan Mach has asked, many scientists studying geoengineering are now proposing using geoengineering to half warming and to buy time for mitigation rather than creating a new climate in perpetuity. Current progress on climate also suggests that RCP 8.5 isn't likely. How does the idea of a smaller and temporary use of geoengineering in a non-scary red earth world change your overall conclusions and assessment of technology governance situation and needs?
Well, it doesn't change my, how to put this? It doesn't change my determination that we need this agency. It just might make that agency's job somewhat easier. You mentioned using it sort of a half climate way, like a little bit to buy time for mitigation. Then the powers that be might very well say, oh, problem fixed. We don't need to mitigate if we are fixing this with technology. And so what this means is that we're buying time and we're not making use of the time. We're not transitioning away from fossil fuels. That's what buying time would be for, to decarbonize the economy, to get rid of fossil fuels entirely, but renewables and nuclear. But if we think we fixed it with technology, the urgency to transition is gone. And then we're in real trouble. Then we're facing what we call termination shock, which is when, if you are using some kind of SRM technology, but you're not removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere at the same time, the minute you stop, sunlight comes back down through the atmosphere with a much higher concentration of greenhouse gases, and the temperature spikes suddenly, much faster than they could adapt to. So the buying time problem, there's a moral hazard there that we really have to be wary of. And that's where I think this agency, if it's properly administered, that's where its moral certitude comes from. That's why we have it, to make sure that these technologies are proceeding for the benefit of the entire planet.
All right, thank you. Stephen Fast asked an interesting question, and that question was, what are your thoughts about countries for whom climate change might be advantageous?
Yes, I'm sitting in one right now. I think it's going to be advantageous up to a point. I think it's going to be countries like Russia, countries like Canada, countries like the Nordic nations up in the far north. They're going to see a benefit up to a certain point of warming. Beyond that, at that point, the benefit starts to erode. So they might be, I don't want to say dragging their feet in the formation of this agency, because that's presuming that I would know what their behavior would be. I can see there's a potential where they might want to slow down the progression of an anti-global warming agency. But again, with the different kinds of costs and trade-offs, the different kinds of effects that each nation would face, they might see an advantage in the short term, but I don't think that advantage lasts very long, the hotter the world gets.
All right, thank you. An anonymous person asked, saying research will be transparent is and sounds good, but considering the recent global impact of what quite possibly was biological scientific research, do you think that the population will trust a geoengineering plan to not have unforeseen consequences?
By bioengineering research gone wrong, I assume you mean COVID. I don't know where COVID began, and I don't have any opinion about whether or not it was naturally created, or naturally formed, or was created in a lab. That I don't know anything about, and I'm not prepared to come to a conclusion on that. But again, this research was performed under this paradigm of sovereignty. So if we have an international agency overseeing geoengineering research, then the confidence comes in that they are transparent. The confidence comes as they are putting out as much information on ongoing experiments as they can, as well as their approval process for greenlighting new experiments. Does that mean there'll be no unforeseen consequences? No. We can never say there won't be unforeseen consequences. Of course there will. But if we have a regularly transparent agency that's competently managed, we can at least maximize confidence, even if not ensure confidence, that if anything comes up, it will be dealt with in a relatively rational way.
Okay, thank you. Another anonymous person asked, while pursuing nuclear energy is and has been for decades a rational approach to clean energy independence, Does this plan give our opponents opportunities to use our political system against us? And they pose the potential for more lawfare or misleading science information. And doesn't this plan give international actors who will ignore any parts of the plan that disrupt them, give them openings to toss wrenches into the gears of the US economy?
I'm sorry, the question didn't quite make sense to me. Does it mean that anybody who is not on board with the formation of an international agency could toss wrenches into the US economy? You mentioned nuclear power. I think as part of an energy portfolio to move away from a carbon-based economy, we need to expand nuclear power, yes. But I don't, this isn't done overnight. Maybe the geoengineering aspect is applicable there to buy us time to move electricity production from coal and natural gas to nuclear. But it has its own downsides. There's no such thing as a perfect form of energy. Everything has pros and cons. So the role of an agency, which honestly we should be doing in this country anyway, is realistically assessing the pros and cons of these different types of energy and determining the portfolio that gives us the best chance of ecological stability. And from ecological stability, that flows economic stability. I think this idea of putting the environment and the economy against one another, that's nuts. That's a false opposition. The economy doesn't work if the ecology doesn't work, right? The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the biosphere. So if we can stabilize the biosphere, we can build an economy on that. But you can only have an economy with a malfunctioning environment for so long before it crashes as well. Hopefully nuclear power can avoid us in coming to that conclusion.
Thank you, Dr. Chalecki.
I'm loving these questions, by the way. Thank you, guys. I'm pleased that you're thinking about all this.
Yeah, and we have 4 more. So the questions have been flowing really rapidly. So thank you, everyone, for posing these questions. Patrick Sullivan has asked if you can expand on what you mean when you say that you're interested in exploring new concepts of sovereignty as it relates to geoengineering.
Well, the traditional international relations concept of sovereignty basically is that every nation can mind its own business, to put it in non-IR shorthand, that what goes on inside your boundaries is inviolable. Your boundaries themselves are inviolable, that what goes on inside your boundaries is your business, and that the only way that nations can deal with one another is through war or trade. They can form alliances if they wish, but they don't have to. Every nation is equal under the law. Every nation minds its own business to the extent that it has business. So we know now that some of those key assumptions are not true. And the COVID pandemic has shown us this, right? I mean, viruses don't stop at the border to get their passports stamped. They come in whether you want them to or not. Heat waves, droughts, storms, floods, carbon dioxide concentrations, they come across the border. So that border is starting to mean less and less. And now in the age of the internet, of course, I mean, money flows across the border, ideas flow across the border, information flows across the border without stopping. So these borders that we've drawn on the map are useful in some aspects and not in others. But our international institutions are based around the idea that these borders are inviolable. So what would geoengineering do to international relations? It's also eroding the idea of sovereignty. It's bringing back this idea that what we've rested our whole IR system on, our whole system of security, is the geographical division of states, and that's meaning less and less as the ecological systems that supports the states don't follow the boundaries. So it's eroding sovereignty further. And at some point, we're going to have to say, what is the point of a sovereign state? It does some things and not others. Does that mean we start breaking down into smaller units? Does that mean we rearrange states into ecological formations like a river basin? Or does that mean we get rid of the idea of states altogether? I don't have the answer to that. I have opinions about it, but we don't know what the future is going to hold. So I think there's a lot of inquiry to be done as to what geoengineering could do to the idea of sovereignty, particularly if it's successful.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chalecki. Michelle asked, science has been warning about this for decades, and democratic populations have consistently failed to push governments to do anything. At what point do we consider that governments just have to make the decision to do something without popular input, or for waiting for everyone to get on board? And should we be considering now how that will ultimately degrade the democratic process itself? In this scary new world, is democracy more important than an autocratic government that at least tries to take care of its citizens? Interesting.
Yeah, this is a larger political science question. So by Democrat, I assume you mean small d Democrat, right? We're not talking American political party here. We're talking about a representative democratic form of government. This is something, again, that there's nothing that says that a democracy or an autocracy is better or worse for the environment. But the decision-making process in a democracy is much more complicated. And so the autocracy could either be better for the environment or worse for the environment, depending on the decision-making process of the individual and whoever they rely on for advice. With the democracy, it requires a lot more public involvement, or should have a lot more public involvement, a lot more public education about the ecology and what it means and why we rely on it. Would environmental disaster be the end of democracy? How much more time do we have? I mean, that's a huge question, right? That's something that would be worth a whole other seminar. You know, that's the kind of question where we think, how do we preserve the ecology? Maybe this idea of democracy is limited in some ways. Maybe we are democratic in some areas and not in others. Maybe we make national security decisions or trade decisions based on democracy, but not environmental decisions. And yet the environment is the system that sits under every other system. So this is the environmental crisis is going to push us into a new consideration of politics and of governance. It's not based on sovereignty. So we need to consider, what does that mean both externally and internally? That's a really good question. And I wish I had a cool, snappy answer, but I think that that's going to be a whole other seminars worth of discussion.
Well, thank you for trying to tackle that large question.
Sounds cool, but we don't have time to get into all of it.
Yeah. So I'm going to combine two questions since they kind of ask the same thing. The questioners were Sean Guillory and John Patrick Akinyemi. And this question is, I think that so Sean specifically says, I think your ideas are brilliant, but I think that this is going to die on the vine of our current information environment / cognitive domain. What are your thoughts on trying to get the message to this new international agency going against the mis or disinformation that's going to face?
We're already facing a lot of misinformation and disinformation, particularly around the climate. I think as the climate disasters start to pile up, you're going to see people looking around for more reliable information than talking heads on TV. And that's where the IPCC really needs to stretch out its publicity arm and make themselves known even more than they already are as the epistemic community when it comes to climate change. As for dying on the vine, I think this vine is going to be around for a while. This attempt at governance might, but there'll be another one after that and another one after that. And I'm optimistic that we can still make international law and international governance work for the big international problems. How exactly we do that? Again, this is yet to be determined. I mean, we're looking far in the future here. This isn't something where we're going to go to the UN tomorrow and say, hey, set up this agency. We can say that now, but this thing, if we're lucky, would be formed in minimum a decade, I think. But that's why we need to talk about it now, so the idea is not completely crazy when it comes time to form it. That's one of the reasons that the Baruch Plan failed. We had actually tried historically under various Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions to govern warfare, to make certain weapons off limits, to make certain tactics and strategies off limits. And it took multiple attempts over decades and even centuries in some cases to lay the international foundation for what is now the UN and the Geneva Conventions. And even then, we know they're not always obeyed. So we have to start laying that intellectual framework now if this is going to bear fruit sometime this coming century. So I'm optimistic that if this event dies on the vine, another one won't.
All right, thank you. So Todd VZ has asked a question, and the question is, nation states had a monopoly on the development of nuclear weapons in the Cold War, but it seems that geoengineering technology development has been democratized to include state and non-state actors. Bringing nations on board for experimental and regulatory controls will be difficult, as you've mentioned. Do you have a sense for how welcoming private sector geoengineering actors would be towards embracing the types of controls and agency that you've recommended?
I think if they're involved in the formation of this agency and they're allowed to have a realistic expectation of what kinds of experiments and technologies could be developed and deployed, they'll be more on board with it. The problem is if the UN forms an agency and then, reaches out and sort of smacks these people with it and says, here's the restrictions now, you can't do what you were going to do. That's when you're going to fight pushback. That's when you're going to, or more pushback. That's when you're going to find resistance to the idea of this being under UN control. I think most universities, most think tanks, even corporations and foundations that are donating money to this, if they had some expectation that they could help steer the ship, as it were, they would be much more open to cooperating with the formation of an agency like this.
All right, thank you. We have 2 more questions, and I think we have time for both of them. So Stefan L. asked, what changes would be necessary in the agriculture and food system? Conventional wisdom often calls for a more widespread adoption of veganism and or vegetarianism, but I've often heard arguments against this as well, often saying that the real problem is monocultures and centralized agriculture. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, again, assuming you're talking about climate change itself, not the geoengineering portion of what we're talking about. How do we avoid scary red earth? Are there food system changes we can make? Oh yeah, absolutely. I've not heard of veganism and vegetarianism applied at the systemic level. That's a choice that each individual makes. If you want to eat less meat or no animal products, that's something that everybody can make. In terms of regenerative agriculture and breaking apart big agricultural monopolies, breaking avoid monocropping and so on, there's a whole train of thought about food security coming from diversity, biodiversity. That's where ecological security comes from in the first place. The robustness of an ecological system is its diversity. So when you cut down a rainforest, and like in Brazil, for example, and you put up, giant soybean plantations or giant grazing areas for cows that then get turned into McBurgers and sent to the United States, that's contributing to the problem of climate change. If we could avoid that in some way, make the systemic change, that would have a huge impact in avoiding scary red earth. Yes, but that's where we, the consumers of the McBurgers, have to talk to our government and say, look, we want to, we want information as to where this stuff comes from. We want you to take the environment into account when you're making a trade deal. And right now, the entire international trade regime goes against that. There's no reason why they would look at environmental indicators as any sort of useful information as to pricing or trade or quality control. They just see it as an unnecessary barrier to trade. And that's something else that's going to have to evolve.
Thank you, Dr. Chalecki. So we'll conclude with this question from Nicholas Mancini. The question is, can you share your thoughts on the slippery slope argument against geoengineering research? In other words, do you find truth in the claim that geoengineering research creates institutional momentum that makes deployment inevitable?
Yes, the slippery slope is a problem. You have foundations like the Gates Foundation, and I don't mean to just pick on him. There's lots, there's foundations that have donated money to this. That's just the first one that comes to mind. They've donated a lot of money. They're going to want to see an ROI on their investment. And they're going to want to see at least some kind of experimental deployment to see whether or not the concept works. So the more we experiment into this, the more we are going to see, we'll have another experiment and maybe a bigger experiment and, lots of different types of technologies. If we prove that, we can prove this technology and this delivery method and so on. Yes, there's a slippery slope that it's the more we put into it, the more, like Robert Oppenheimer said, this technology is so sweet, it has to be used. We're going to see the greater chances of deployment. But again, if that's the case, we have to then weigh the costs and the benefits of this deployment against the costs and benefits of what happens if we don't do it. This is not a simple linear equation. We have to go back and assess this every time. And you mentioned in your intro that I had worked on geoengineering and just war. A co-author of mine and I wrote this article about modifying just war theory to apply to geoengineering. And one of the key philosophical tenets that we kept coming up against and against was the good has to outweigh the bad, the double effect principle, in effect, that you have to reassess this all the time. Are you doing more good than harm? What about now? What about now? Are you still doing more good than harm? Okay, redefine harm, redefine good. Are you still doing it? Like it's not one and done. You have to keep going over this. So if we are indeed on the slippery slope to geoengineering deployment, and again, not necessarily convinced that's a catastrophe, but if we're on the slippery slope, then we have to grab a handhold wherever we can. And that requires us to reassess this double effect principle all the time to make sure that we're in fact deploying these technologies for the general good and not for the good of one country.
Well, Dr. Chalecki, thank you again so much for your insights during
Yeah.
your presentation and for
Thanks
such
for having me.
such a lively and engaging Q&A. I really appreciate all of your answers to our questions. And thank you to our audience members for posing all those fantastic questions.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Those were great questions.
Well, thank you. And have a great day, everyone.